Only a few years ago, North Korea was isolated and impoverished, a global pariah wholly dependent on China. Today, Pyongyang is booming, thanks to a flood of Russian money, and it's fast becoming a dangerous regional power in its own right, with a nuclear arsenal that can threaten the continental United States. Quite an extraordinary turnaround for its eccentric dictator, Kim Jong Un. So, how has North Korea done it, and what should the West do about it? I'm Tom.
And I'm Patrick. Welcome to The General and the Journalist.
Well, joining us today to explain that incredibly dramatic transformation in North Korea, I'm very pleased to say, is Dr. Victor Cha, who is one of the US's leading experts on the Korean Peninsula. Dr. Cha is also a practitioner of the arts. He's a former White House national security official under George W. Bush and then a Pentagon advisor under President Joe Biden. He's now the career chair at the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Cha, or Victor, as we may call you, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, as we've just said, you've worked for Republican and Democrat presidents alike. I won't ask you which one was your favorite, unless you wanted to share that with us. But perhaps I'll ask you something slightly different. Which of the US presidents of all we've seen in the last 20 years do you think understood the particular conundrum of North Korea the best?
It's a hard question to answer, Tom. I mean, I think that they all had to understand it because at one point or another, there was a crisis with regard to North Korea in every single presidential administration. What I will say is that I think there were three presidents that chose to deal with it in three different ways. The first was Bill Clinton, who decided to do a bilateral negotiation with North Korea, just the United States and North Korea at the table, to try to make an agreement on denuclearization. Then there was the administration that I worked for that basically framed the North Korea issue as a regional security problem and said that it should not just be the United States, but China, Russia, Japan, and both Koreas should be at the table, the so-called six-party talks. And then the third was actually Donald Trump in his first term in office, who said that basically the way I'm going to deal with this is I'm just going to talk directly to the North Korean leader to see if we can make a deal. So three very different approaches, all to try to deal with this this national security issue.
Yeah, and very arguably, none of the three, all being very different, worked. But we're going to get to that. First, Victor, it's the transformation in North Korea economically is, I think, unknown to many of us. We're just really learning about it now. The capital, Pyongyang, we're used to all these drab pictures of communism and poverty, but it's a completely different city than it was a few years ago, isn't it? Can you paint a picture of the city? You know it well. You've been there several times. What does it look like now?
So the interesting thing was when I went there as a U.S. government official, I would get driven down the main streets of Pyongyang in the morning, going to the foreign ministry for a meeting. And it was like any other morning in any other city. You saw school kids going to school, people waiting for buses. But there were certain things that really gave you a sense of the underdevelopment of the country. So, for example, in this modern day and age, in the morning, you would not normally think of people lining up at a payphone to make their phone call for the morning, or that there would be brownouts. So it's a temporary power failure. These days, you don't see those sorts of things in North Korea. There are gleaming skyscrapers. Everybody has a cell phone, even though it's connected not to the internet, but to the intranet, a North Korean cellular system with no access to the global internet. So there's been quite a bit of development. Now, we can certainly talk about why we think this development is happening, but the city is certainly a very different place from when it was pre-COVID, and a very different place from the first few years after COVID.
We had a fascinating report in the Wall Street Journal, Victor, about all this a few weeks back. BMW dealerships on the streets of Pyongyang, pet stores, internet gaming cafes, and all the sort of things you just wouldn't think, would be there. And the numbers are absolutely fascinating, aren't they? And these are the estimates from a lot of different economists. The Bank of Korea, for example. North Korea's grown at 3% or above for the last 3 years in a row, 3.7%, I think, in 2024, the biggest growth. So that's faster, not only than the entirety of the European Union, not only than the United States, but also every single country in the G7. Incredible numbers. I guess the obvious question is it all over the country, though? where is that growth? Is it just Pyongyang and that great influx that's coming in from foreign powers, or is economic wealth and prosperity spread everywhere?
The first thing I would say is all your listeners should not all of a sudden start thinking about investing in North Korea. It's not something that I would advise. So I think there are a couple of reasons for the trend lines. One is that, as you said, this has happened over the last 3 to 4 years. This is a period of rapid growth from a very low starting point. In other words, in right after COVID, North Korea shut down for 3.5 years during COVID, where the economy literally ground to a halt. So you were starting from zero or even negative growth to see these massive increases. The second thing, as your question suggests, is that this is really largely confined to the city of Pyongyang, where most of the elite live, is just in the city of Pyongyang. And outside of this major capital city, North Korea still is a very poorly developed country, very underdeveloped country, largely because the government has made the political decision to just service the elite within Pyongyang, and not the rest of the country, who they see, and they have a very class stratified system, and the people who live outside of Pyongyang are considered not loyal or questionably loyal. So they experience none of the benefits that we see taking place in Pyongyang.
So, as you say, this has all happened since COVID. I think many of us remember what a disaster COVID was for North Korea and how disastrous North Korea's management of the pandemic was. And that particular scene of Kim Jong Un going on national television to apologize for betraying the people of North Korea's trust. And he did it in tears. He cried openly. And it really felt that this was a man, a dictator at his complete weakest now. Then, obviously, the huge changes have happened, and we'll get into why. But has his personal power and strength grown alongside the country's economy?
Oh, I think almost certainly it has. When he started out, he took over after the sudden death of his father, and many people thought that he would not be able to survive. But he conducted a lot of purges inside the country, both in the military and in the party, to consolidate his position. And the recent spate of economic growth, I think, only makes more certain that he's firmly in control. Having said that, it's North Korea. So tomorrow the regime could change and we would say, oh, we're not really surprised by that. On the other hand, it could last for another 30 years and we wouldn't be surprised by that. We wouldn't be surprised by that either. Um, but I do think that part of the reason, as you mentioned, that Kim Jong Un was so um, uh, emotional and when he apologized to the people was, in the first 2 years of the pandemic, they made the political decision to say there was no virus in the country. And even though they knew there was a virus in the country, hospitals were rejecting people who said that they had COVID. People they diagnosed with high fever, they said had the flu because politically they could not report. The doctors could not report that there was COVID in the country. And this just created a horrible environment. There was no vaccines. There was no PPE, personal protective equipment that was provided by the government. None of these sorts of things. And so I think that was part of the reason why, and that was also part of the reason why Kim Jong Un went on this massive building spree, building housing units and things in North Korea to try to deliver and show development in the aftermath of COVID.
Victor, I want to take you to just what has fueled this economic growth. And the common narrative that one reads is that Russia has become North Korea's economic lifeline since the invasion of Ukraine. How transformative has that relationship really been?
I don't think one can overestimate how transformative it has been. The war in Ukraine and Russia's need for ammunition coincided with North Korea coming out of its 3.5 year lockdown, no trade with China for 3.5 years. They were utterly destitute economically. And it was actually Kim Jong Un who proposed the idea to Vladimir Putin of, we can send you ammunition, we can send you troops. And Putin initially demurred, but then later, he needed ammunition, and the only country in the world that was willing to provide him ammunition was the North Koreans. It wasn't very good ammunition in the beginning, but it got better and better as they got their ammunition factories up and running again. So, and we estimate at CSIS the value of what Russia has given in return is probably somewhere on the order of $8 to $10 billion worth of everything from medicine to food to energy to weapons has been provided to the North Korean leaders. So this completely transformed the Russia-North Korea relationship. If we put aside the pandemic, prior to this, the Soviet Union in 1990 effectively abandoned North Korea when it normalized relations with South Korea. And it stopped providing energy assistance to North Korea at sort of Cold War patron discounted rates. There was no economic relationship. There are two border crossings between North Korea and Russia, two railway crossings. Nothing was happening on those railway crossings. Now, because of the war in Ukraine, if you look at the Tumangan-Kasan railway crossing, which we have done with satellite imagery, it is bustling. It is absolutely bustling. The customs area on both sides, new infrastructure. The North Koreans have built a new road on their side to manage all the traffic going back and forth. The biggest gift that Kim Jong Un could have hoped for was Russia's war in Ukraine after he came out of the pandemic.
I mean, I remember being absolutely astonished when we saw that strategic partnership being signed. Most of us assumed that Russia would be the senior partner, but 2 years on, who's actually extracted more value from the relationship? Who got the better deal?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you're right. I mean, traditionally, it's always been a patron-client relationship, where the North Koreans were always asking for something from the Soviets and from the Russians. Now, I think it's a very different situation. I mean, Putin is um, very dependent on ammunition, something like 6 million rounds, according to the Ukrainians, 6 million rounds of ammunition and more. The Ukrainian estimates are somewhere between 11 and 20,000 North Korean troops have been up in the Kursk region. There was a report the other day that said the Russians are looking for 30,000 more North Korean troops.
Right.
And then on top of that, it's North Korean laborers that are in Russian factories building drones. We just to give an example, we identified a factory in the Yelabuga special economic zone that is a drone factory. It's in Russia, and it is making Iranian-designed drones using North Korean labor and Chinese microelectronics.
There's the axis of autocracies right there.
That's it right there. It's operating right there. So the Russians are as dependent, if not more dependent, on the North Koreans than they've ever been.
Victor, just on those troop numbers, the initial 15, 20,000, perhaps 30,000 more to come, is that having any effect whatsoever on North Korean society, or is it just not even known?
Well, I think the information is tightly controlled in North Korea. Initially, when they had those very high casualty rates, which was to be expected because the Russians were basically just sending them out there as cannon fodder. I mean, they didn't speak the language, they knew nothing. And the information was very much controlled. And so initially, when those high casualty rates were happening, the North Koreans were not even acknowledging that they were publicly that they were sending troops there. But I would say over the last year, maybe that's changed quite a bit, where the North Koreans now are framing a narrative in which the ones who are coming back are seen as war heroes. So they're the ones who are coming back in caskets. He's treating them as war heroes, and the ones who come back, who rotate out, he's treating as war heroes. Because the other element of this, which I think also motivated Kim Jong Un to offer troops, is that his military, which is 1.1 million man military, has no actual battle experience. They have no experience. And as we've seen, the war in Ukraine has introduced us to new ways of war, and he very much wanted to learn about those new ways of war. He's completely shifted the narrative away from not acknowledging the failures initially to celebrating victory. They even created, this is unheard of, they created a war memorial in North Korea for those who were killed in the battle in Ukraine, to which high-level Russian officials have come and paid respect. So they've really turned this into a celebration of the alliance between Russia and North Korea, as well as for their own tactical battlefield training and strategy purposes.
That's really interesting because it implies, when you shed blood alongside a partner or an ally, as we've done with the United States for some time, it creates bonds. And I guess that has a bearing on the variable geometry, the sort of triangular relationship between China, North Korea, and Russia. China historically has always been North Korea's indispensable patron, often a liability rather than an asset. But has Russia now become a genuine alternative, or is Beijing still really the only country that matters to Kim Jong Un?
I think Russia has become an alternative, and this is in part reflected in the way that China has really tried to pick up the pace of re-engaging with North Korea. It was a little bit slow and sleepy after the pandemic. They opened the border, they resumed trade, but the trade didn't come near pre-pandemic levels. That has all changed in the last year. China has tried very hard to make inroads into North Korea. Xi Jinping has hosted something like 17 world leaders to date, maybe more, in 2026. The only overseas trip he took was to North Korea. That was the only place. And they reached a major agreement where they talked about expanding cooperation in all areas: energy, tourism, health, agriculture, in all sorts of areas. So this, I think, reflects China's desire to regain some of the influence they've had over North Korea. The Chinese would tell us in negotiations that they had very little influence over North Korea, but they jealously guard whatever little influence they claim to have. And to see the Russians making inroads, I think, makes the Chinese very suspect. So North Korea is now in a position where they are being courted by both China and Russia. This was the only time we really saw this in the past was during the Cold War, during the Sino-Soviet split, where both the Chinese and the Soviets were trying to enlist North Korea as sort of their loyal communist patron in their two competing, communist ideologies. So in a sense, Kim Jong Un, the current leader, has replicated the sort of pivot strategy of his grandfather of being able to play Russia and China off of one another.
Let's talk about the crinks, the so-called crinks, or the axis of autocracies. How seriously should we take it? I mean, you gave a really good example, a really powerful example of what it looks like in action. Are we overstating it, or is it simply my enemy's enemy is my friend?
It's actually a really good question, and we're actually starting a big study at CSIS on this very question of, to what extent do tactical and transactional autocratic alliances become strategic? My concern, my suspicion is that in the North Korea-Russia case, there are longer legs to this, that this is starting to look strategic, the fact that they have a fully executed defense treaty. The thing that is most troubling to me about the Russia influence over North Korea is that the Chinese, when they have influence over North Korea, they don't do a lot, but they also try to prevent North Korea from really doing bad things. So the Chinese, have really discouraged North Korea from doing a seventh nuclear test, have discouraged them from doing ICBM tests that might enrage the United States. But I don't think Russia would care. I don't think Russia would care if North Korea did a seventh nuclear test, or if the Iranians came to the North Koreans to ask them to help them reconstitute their nuclear program. I think the Chinese would have a big problem with that. I don't think the Russians would care. I don't think they would care. So even if the CRINC isn't fully cohered as a strategic alliance, like, for example, the US, Japan, and South Korea, there's still a lot of bad things that could happen that radiate out from the peninsula. As we've seen, this Russia-North Korea tie is not something that just affects security on the Korean Peninsula and the Indo-Pacific. It's clearly also affecting the situation in Europe.
Victor, the character of Kim Jong Un himself, though, he's well known to us, isn't he? He's been running North Korea for 15 years now, since his father's death. He's only 42, but he's a well-known character. And really, he's portrayed in the West as a bit of a comic figure, a caricature of a dictator. He has been very overweight in the past. He's got a pretty shocking haircut that would make him stand out in most pubs and bars across America and Britain. But look what he's now done. Have we underestimated him in the West?
We've underestimated every North Korean leader, and in particular the current one. Like you said, that they have just been caricatures. They're the joke of late night TV shows. You can find many sort of political cartoons that make fun of them. And there probably was good reason for that in the past. They would do missile tests that blew up once they launched the missile, or blow up on the launch pad, things of that nature. There've been movies made, that made fun of the regime. But the thing about it is that even though we make fun of them, even though they were under a global sanctions regime with 11 UN Security Council resolutions, they have been very transparent and clear that their goal is to be a nuclear weapon state the size of France or Britain. That is their goal, with 20 different delivery systems. And now including hypersonic cruise missiles that might be nuclear tipped, drone capacity, cyber, which we haven't talked about. They have exceeded everyone's expectations every single time. And so in the analyst community, every time North Korea did some missile test, people would say, "Oh yeah, that was a successful missile test, but they still aren't able to do A, B, and C. They can't do a reentry vehicle. We don't know if they have a heat shield. We don't know what their circular probability error is on their guidance systems." But every single time they have ticked off each one of those things. I think at our peril, we underestimate this regime and what their goals are, because they are slowly, methodically plotting towards achieving these goals.
That's quite an alarming picture, because what you're saying is that the North Koreans, if I heard you right, the North Koreans actually have developed some pretty advanced military technology without any external help, and they've now got the Russians who can do technology transfer for them. So, how serious is this now? And do you, where would you put them in terms of technology and their competitiveness?
Yeah, so this is the big, important, unanswered question. The Russians have provided a lot of fuel. They provided a lot of food. They've provided medicine. They provided conventional military weapons. And the big question is whether they are providing sort of the high-end technology. The Soviet Union traditionally has not been willing to do that. But the Soviet Union is not Putin's Russia in a war in Ukraine, where they are, in a sense, desperate for North Korean troops and ammunition. The first tranche of troops that North Korea sent to the Kursk region basically allowed Putin not to do a second draft, a second military conscription. And so the North Koreans are not stupid, right? They know that Putin needs this, and so they're going to ask for a high price. They're not going to say, "Oh, we're just happy with some food and some energy and some grain." They're going to exact a high price for that, and so we don't know. We try to track through imagery what is going across the border, but if we're talking about military technology, very hard, right? It's very hard to do that, as you know well. But what we can track is what the U.S. government statements on this have been. And we saw in particular during the Biden administration, the statements that the government was making was about, initially started out as concern about the threat of proliferation in the Russia-North Korea exchanges that were taking place, to later in the term, not just concern about the threat or about the possibility, but concern about the proliferation, right? So they took out the conditional. So it makes one concerned. But again, this is material that is not in the open sources. There was one very interesting Spanish news report about a Russian flagged ship in the Sea of Gibraltar that sank. And imagery of the ship showed two large tarp structures on top of the ship, on the deck of the ship. There were large tarp structures that could have been nuclear propulsion reactors for submarines. And so this is one of the areas where Kim Jong Un has been very clear that North Korea wants to develop nuclear submarines. Very clear. He's been very clear about that. Their best chance at getting that sort of technology is going to be from Russia. It's not going to be from anybody else. So, I mean, these are sort of the key things like military satellites, ICBM countermeasure capabilities, so to be able to decoys and things to throw up U.S. ground-based interceptor systems, nuclear propulsion submarines. These are the things that Kim Jong Un has said are on his wish list, and I'm sure he's looking to Russia to try to get those things.
And you mentioned cyber. I mean, clearly they are a formidable cyber actor, and we've suffered the consequences from it. They're about to launch, I think, the first surveillance satellite or reconnaissance satellite, if they haven't got one up there already. But I just wanted to dwell on the nuclear for a second, and really just reflect on their emerging nuclear doctrine as their nuclear arsenal grows. Is this still purely about regime survival through deterrence, or are they moving towards a more coercive doctrine that might lower the threshold for nuclear use?
Yeah, Patrick, I think it's a good question, and my answer is I think it's the latter. That their effort at building tactical nuclear weapons, they've always made statements about a defensive nuclear doctrine, but now they have explicitly disavowed a no first use doctrine. And they've stated very clearly they will use nuclear weapons first in response to any sort of threat of conventional or nuclear attack from the adversary. This is happening at a time where Russia has also, in the context of the war in Ukraine and threats to NATO, has said that they could potentially use nuclear weapons first. And then also China is in a massive nuclear buildup now, that many people believe, even though they espouse a no first use doctrine, that is effectively not the case anymore. So we actually tried to do a data scraping language learning model exercise, taking essentially what were thousands of North Korean public government statements about their nuclear weapons program and coding them to determine what is defensive and what is offensive in terms of doctrine. And very clearly there's a mix, but really over the last 5 years, reference to offensive use of weapons has gone up relative to defensive use of weapons. So that appears to be the trend line. And as I said, if anybody had a doubt, the government, subsequent to Putin's statement that he would use nuclear weapons first, the North Koreans said the same thing.
So, Victor, you very powerfully established that North Korea, far from being a bit of a joke, is actually a really quite powerful country these days, and really quite a potentially threatening and dangerous one as well. 30 years of the West, led by the US, attempts to denuclearize North Korea has palpably failed. I think the most current estimates by the Federation of American Scientists a couple of years back is that they have enough fissile material to produce something like 90 warheads. It's believed to have around 50 warheads, but certainly at some stage, we don't know quite when, over the last 10 to 20 years, they became not just a nuclear armed nation, but a powerful one with the delivery method, ballistic missiles, to put those nuclear warheads kind of most places they want to. Why have all those different attempts, some of which you've been involved in, to denuclearize North Korea failed?
There have been many debates about this in the expert community. Some people blame the mode of negotiation, bilateral, multilateral summits, versus experts. Others put it up to partisan politics, Democrats versus Republican administrations in the United States, conservative versus progressive governments in Korea. But to me, the simplest explanation is that we fail because they don't want to give up their weapons. That's why we fail.
Yeah.
And so occasionally they would make agreements, temporary agreements, in which they would get things to freeze their program. But in the end, they were always working on an alternative program, or they were working on some other aspect of their missile program, which we've never made an agreement with North Korea on the delivery system as opposed to the weapon. And so I think in the end, the United States has tried many different ways to use diplomacy to denuclearize North Korea, many different types of formats at different levels, um, with and without partners, bilaterally versus with others. Um, at the very highest levels, Donald Trump meeting his good friend Kim Jong Un, and none of these have succeeded. And the only explanation to me is because they do not desire to give up their weapons. They do not desire to make the trade, which is economic benefits, political normalization, a peace treaty, a normalization settlement with Japan that could give North Korea billions of dollars, um, membership in the international community of nations. These are all the things that have been on offer throughout many different U.S. administrations, packaged in different forms, but that's sort of the core deal. They've just not been willing to accept that, to give up their weapons.
I guess to put it another way, we didn't make them an offer they couldn't refuse through whatever which way we tried. And you refer to Donald Trump being the last one who tried that. It all, though, begs the question, what do we then do? This is a problem. We failed to solve it so far. We're really going to have to try harder to come up with some sort of solution. And you've got some ideas on that, haven't you? What do we do next?
As you can imagine, because of my work on this issue, both as a scholar and as a practitioner, I'm always thinking about it. And I think I wrote a piece last couple of months ago where I think we basically need to change our policy to North Korea, and at least for now, not focus so much on denuclearization, and in particular focus on trying to engage North Korea in diplomacy with four objectives. One of them is to basically reduce the threat, having to do with their nuclear weapons, their ballistic missiles to the United States in particular. So, a nuclear test ban, ICBM test ban, these sorts of things. The other is to engage North Korea as a way to try to reduce the tie between Russia and North Korea, because there is nothing that is reducing that tie. Um, Third is to engage North Korea to reduce the chances of nuclear first use. I mean, as I said a few minutes ago, this is the only part of the world in which you have a concentration of nuclear powers, all of whom have disavowed the no first use doctrine, as just defensive. And then fourth, the United States, we've got a lot of enemies right now around the world that we are engaged in direct or indirect conflict with. Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Hamas, the Houthis. I mean, the list goes on and on. And we need to sort of reduce the number of enemies that we're dealing with at this point. And perhaps North Korea, because of Donald Trump's professed personal friendship with Kim Jong Un, that might be the one where we try this. So it's not giving up on denuclearization. But Tom, as you said, I mean, we're not talking here about Libya that's creating up some precursors to a nuclear weapons. This is a country that has an extant nuclear weapons program, 50 nuclear weapons, enough fissile material for 100. And Kim has announced he's going into mass production of nuclear weapons now. So we have to be realistic, right, about our goals, and to sort of sit on a high horse and say, we're not going to talk to you seriously until you give up all your weapons. That's just not practical. I mean, it's something you can say that might make sense in Washington, D.C., but when you're actually out there and you have to negotiate with the North Koreans, you have to think about what you can get that is good for U.S. national security and security of our allies. And I think it's those four goals.
I mean, look, they sound very admirable, and why shouldn't we try then? If you don't mind me saying, though, we're still coming up hard against the realpolitik of what's in it for Kim. Why would he ever want to abandon the axis of upheaval when he seems to be doing pretty well from it? And it seems to me we still haven't got an offer, and perhaps you could correct me, Victor, but what would you give him that Beijing and Moscow currently isn't?
I don't think materially there are things that the U.S. could give North Korea that would compete with what China and Russia are giving to them. There's something that is not material that North Korea wants, and that is to be able to sit face to face with the two countries that it has not had relations with in the region. The United States and Japan, like the number one and the number three largest economies in the world, to sit face to face with them as a nuclear weapon state. Like that is, it's not material, but it is extremely important for North Korea. That has been one of their goals from the 1960s when they started this program. And so I think that would be enticing to them. I think they would like to accomplish these things, be in a dialogue with the United States and in a dialogue with Japan, while shutting out their rival South Korea, while not having dialogue with South Korea, given the competitive nature of this relationship. So I think there are reasons for them to come to talks. And then they've learned in Trump's second term that not only is he more unpredictable, that he's also more likely to use force, military force. And so I would imagine there are some in Kim's circle that are saying, it might be good to sort of reach out and touch Donald just to sort of keep him on the good side so that he doesn't think of a Venezuela with us or Iran with us or, a Cuba type situation. Who knows what's going to happen in Cuba, that sort of thing. So I think there are reasons that North Korea might be interested that go simply beyond the material, that focus more on the strategic and tactical.
Yeah. Pick up the phone to the big rocket man the next time he rings, maybe.
That's right. That's right.
Sound advice. How fascinating. I must also just quickly ask you about what Kim Jong Un seems to have done in the last few months in anointing his successor. He hasn't said so quite as many words, but he just made it very clear, hasn't he, that his daughter, Kim Yue, who is either 12 or 14, it's a little unclear. We didn't actually know she existed until a few years ago. But she now goes everywhere with him. He goes for rides in tanks with her. She's there when he's testing his missiles. What does that tell us about Kim and how long he expects to stick around, do you think?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. Like, this younger daughter has now been brought out in the public with him and all these things. I mean, we take our kids to the amusement park. He takes his kid to a ballistic missile launch. Yeah, I guess everybody has their own way of raising their kids.
It's one form of parenting, isn't it? We should try that, Pat.
and the way we learned about the kid, was when Dennis Rodman.
Dennis Rodman, wasn't it? Yeah. The basketball player.
Wow.
Yeah, who met the baby and came back and said, like, he met the baby, Jue. So that's how we learned about her and her name. But I think what it says the most about Kim Jong Un is, I think it's an externalization of how he remembers how unprepared he was when he took office. Like, he was completely unprepared. And it was very obvious in the beginning that he was very tentative and wasn't sure what to do. And so I don't think he wants for whatever reason, his daughter, he doesn't want her to be in that position. The other thing that's interesting about this is, at different times he's put himself out in the public eye with his wife, and at other times with his younger sister, and now with his daughter. He does not put himself out in the public eye with another man, because I think he finds that threatening in one way or another. With the daughter, there's speculation. Maybe she's a successor. We don't know for sure. But if he did that with a son, everybody would just assume that is the successor. And so I think that there's a reason why he puts himself out there only with women, right? Because he sees them as less threatening. In a one-man dictatorship, you don't want to be seen as the lame duck. So I think that's also something that's reflected in what he's doing with his daughter.
Victor, final question. I'm going to deploy my favorite Yogi Berra quote. I think it's Yogi Berra. Predictions are hard, especially when it's about the future. But I'm going to ask you to do a prediction anyway. If we spoke again in 5 years' time, what would surprise people most about North Korea?
The first thing I would say is 5 years from now, the regime could be gone and we wouldn't be surprised, right? But 5 years from now, we could be in the same position we are, or North Korea could be thriving even more, and we wouldn't be surprised by that either. I mean, I think that is how wide the possibilities are. The second thing I'll say is that the best thing that is happening in North Korea for the future has been the growth of civil society as it relates to markets. because there are markets now in North Korea. There are official markets, there are black markets. The government relies on them because the long time ago the public distribution system broke down, and these markets are where people are improving the quality of their life. Through goods coming in from China, for now probably from Russia. And so I think that's the best thing that's happening in the country from a human rights and from a future of the country perspective. And if that dynamic, that market dynamic starts to infect the politics of the country, that'll be all for the better.
Victor, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so
That was
much.
brilliant.
Really, really interesting. I'm both feel smarter and also slightly more worried, which is probably a good thing on both sides. We're really grateful for your time.
Thanks, Victor. That was brilliant.
Patrick, before we go, we've got time for a listener's question. This one from Charlie. It's really interesting, actually. I think it's possibly Charlie's a man after your own heart. But Charlie says this: I love listening to your podcast every week on the drive back to camp each Sunday. I wondered whether you had any advice for a junior officer who's recently been commissioned, because the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, certainly seems to be applicable to the world today. Do the British public really have an appetite to back more support for the military, is Charlie's killer question.
Well, first of all, congratulations on commissioning Charlie into the most professional and the most storied army of its size in the world. And actually, thank you for serving your country. Stepping forward like that is really admirable. Most senior officers tend to say that they would give anything to exchange places with you. Don't believe a word of it. I've spent more time than I care to mention living in a wet shell scrape in Brecon, and you're welcome to it. It's your turn now. But I think on the issue of public support, you've put your finger on something incredibly important. We should be honest that Britain's armed forces, the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and the British Army do enjoy, extraordinarily high levels of support, higher than almost any other institution, and a lot of respect from the British public. And we do inspire national pride. And there's also, as you'll have read in the papers, a lot of general support for increased defence spending, but that tends to be as long as it doesn't affect people's pockets. So I think that the problem we have is that we are admired in the abstract, but we're not well understood. And nor do the British public yet understand the threats that we face, the need to invest, or indeed the need to mobilize society for national resilience in a way that other countries, and most obviously the Nordics and Sweden and Finland, have done. So that's one of the reasons why Tom and I started this podcast. And we will try to serve you by making the case every week so that when you do find yourself being sent into harm's way, as you will sooner or later, that you're well trained, you're well equipped, and you've got the country at your back.
Nice answer, Patrick. And we do somewhat have high hopes for this new government, this new Prime Minister, that he may just engage the country a little bit more. Precisely this debate that we're also trying to do, don't we? But Patrick, you've got a gilt-edged opportunity here to address a brand new young officer. What's the one little bit of advice you could give him so he could one day make it all the way up to 4-star and Chief of the General Staff?
I could spend all day on this, Tom. So off the top of my head, I'd say two things. First of all, be curious, be intellectually curious. One of the reasons that British officers and NCOs carry so much influence and punch above their weight is because there is an enormous amount of intellectual curiosity and you become masters of your trade, and that is your first job. But the most important piece of advice, and you will have heard this every single day as you went through Sandhurst and had that motto of serve to lead drummed into you, is look after your soldiers, put them first. They will look after you.
Well, sounds tough, Patrick. And Charlie, thank you for listening. That is all for us this week. Next week, we're excited to have the author, historian, and celebrity television presenter, nonetheless, Simon Sebag Montefiore, in the studio with us to discuss his new book, The Cauldron, which is all about how the modern Middle East was made. We've had a little look at it now. It's an absolutely fascinating read. So join us for that.
And thanks for listening. And do send in any of your questions to generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. And please follow us and give us a rating, a review, or a comment wherever you're listening to the podcast, because it helps more people discover us. So until next week, thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Patrick.